Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The hum of Port Harcourt never truly slept. It only changed its rhythm. The city breathed with the heartbeat of generators, the murmur of distant laughter, the occasional honk that sliced through the night like an impatient blade. On Cedar Lane, a street tucked between old mansions and new ambitions, stood a house that seemed to hold its breath. It was the house of Nurse Elizabeth Hartford, though most people had shortened her name long ago to Nurse Lizzie. Her reputation had grown over the years like a stubborn vine, green in public, thorny in private. She was the woman who never missed a shift, the one who could stitch a wound with eyes half closed, yet the one who never smiled unless the world forced her to. Inside her home, there was order sharp enough to draw blood, chairs aligned like soldiers, curtains folded like patient files, and silence so deep it had a personality of its own. The smell of disinfectant followed her everywhere, even on Sundays. It clung to her like invisible armor, the scent of someone who had seen too much illness to believe in softness. The neighbors called her the Iron Nurse behind closed doors, whispering that her heart must have been scrubbed too clean to feel. She had once been married, years ago, to a gentle mechanic named Michael Hartford. His laughter used to fill the house, until one rainy evening when a truck crushed his car along ABA Road. From that day, Lizzie's world narrowed to two things: her job and her daughter Claire. She wore grief the way some women wore jewelry, daily, quietly, and with a strange kind of pride. When she walked into her gate after work, her heels striking the tiles like a metronome of authority, her housekeeper Martha would straighten like a frightened cat. "Good evening, Ma," Martha would whisper, but Lizzie's eyes were always miles away. Her words came measured, clipped. She believed efficiency was love, and obedience was peace, but those beliefs made her home colder than a hospital ward at midnight. Every morning began with the same precision. Lizzie woke before dawn, her alarm slicing through the last layer of sleep like a scalpel through gauze. She would stand by the mirror, tying her scarf with the accuracy of a soldier tightening armor. Outside, the city coughed itself awake, buses revving, sellers setting up their wares, a mosque's call drifting faintly across the roofs. The streets were already alive, but Lizzie moved through them like someone on a different wavelength. Her housekeeper knew better than to delay her breakfast. One missing spoon of sugar could ignite a storm. The tea must steam without spilling, the toast must not darken. Martha often muttered under her breath, "Money sweet, but Madamone too strong." It was her way of surviving the tension that hung around that house like stale air. Lizzie, on her part, was blind to her own severity. In her mind, order was safety, and safety was love. She thought she was protecting herself and her daughter from chaos, but the truth was that she was building walls so high even affection couldn't climb over. When she drove to work through GRA's clean streets, she rarely looked out the window. Her mind was already in the hospital corridors, where she felt both queen and servant. The wards respected her. New nurses watched her with admiration, but none dared cross her. To them, she was a legend, the woman who stitched through the night during the cholera outbreak, who once revived a dying child with hands steady as steel. Yet, when she returned home, her victories evaporated into the emptiness of her sitting room. The chairs waited for conversations that never came. Her late husband's photo hung on the wall, a silent witness to a heart that refused to heal. Sometimes, in rare moments of exhaustion, she'd catch her reflection in the mirror and not recognize the woman staring back. A face drawn tight by years of control, eyes haunted by something she never named. Claire, her daughter, was her only flame, but Lizzie guarded that flame with iron bars. The girl was 16 and already restless, a butterfly fluttering too close to a window. She wanted laughter, color, the noisy friends her mother called useless distractions. Lizzie wanted her daughter to walk with her head high, to become a woman respected, not whispered about. She didn't understand that Claire's laughter was not rebellion, it was oxygen. Each time Lizzie scolded her for staying out too late or laughing too loudly, something small cracked between them. Their evenings became minefields of silence. The house that once echoed with Michael's guitar now carried only the tension between mother and daughter. "Mother," Claire once said quietly while setting the table, "you act like love is a punishment." Lizzie froze, her hand tightening around the fork. "When you grow up, you'll understand," she replied. But what Claire understood was fear, fear of speaking, fear of being herself under her mother's roof. The neighbors began to notice her sadness. Martha, the housekeeper, sometimes slipped her sweet bread behind her mother's back, whispering, "Eat, my Pekin. Don't let sorrow shrink you." But even Martha knew her days were numbered. Lizzie's patience for servants was shorter than a candle in Harmattan. The day Martha broke a plate, Lizzie's rage came down like thunder. "Do you think my money grows on trees?" she shouted. Martha packed her things before sunset. As she walked out, she turned once to look at the house and said softly, "A house with no laughter is already half dead." Lizzie heard her, but said nothing. Pride sealed her mouth tighter than grief ever could. That night, rain washed the city, but Lizzie didn't notice. She sat by the window, staring into the dark, her mind circling old wounds. The smell of wet earth filled the air, and in the distance, thunder rolled like a tired god. She remembered Michael's laughter again, how it used to chase away her worries, how his hands steadied her heartbeat. Then she remembered Claire's voice earlier that day, soft but cutting, asking, "Why are you always angry, Mother?" She had no answer. The city lights flickered against the raindrops, each one trembling like a secret she could never tell. Down the street, someone was playing music, a love song drifting through the wet night. Lizzie felt a sudden sting behind her eyes, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in years. But she blinked it away. Tears, she believed, were for the weak. Instead, she turned off the light and sat in darkness, clutching her phone, scrolling through old photos of her daughter in her school uniform. She zoomed in on the smile she'd once called careless, now realizing how rare it had become. Outside, Port Harcourt moved on, traders closing their stalls, taxis splashing through puddles, a city that never mourned anyone for long. Inside, Lizzie's house stood silent, the sound of rain filling its hollow spaces. For all her money, her discipline, her fine curtains, she could not buy what she truly lacked: warmth. She thought of calling Claire's number, but pride stopped her fingers. Instead, she whispered to the shadows, "Tomorrow will be better." Yet even she didn't believe it. The rain fell harder, and the walls seemed to sigh, as if the house itself knew that something deep and dangerous was beginning to crack within her. Morning crept over Port Harcourt with the reluctant grace of an exhausted child. The streets, still damp from the previous night's rain, shimmered beneath a haze of early light. Lizzie sat by the kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She had slept little. Dreams had come and gone like uninvited guests, faces she could no longer remember, laughter she could almost hear but never place. When she finally stood, the stiffness in her back reminded her of time's cruelty. Her phone buzzed with messages from the hospital. There was always someone needing her precision, her authority. But for the first time in years, she ignored them. The quiet inside the house was strange, almost alive, and her own breath seemed loud enough to wake the walls. As she moved through the rooms, she caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror, the same rigid posture, the same neat uniform. Yet her eyes betrayed her. They looked like eyes that had seen ghosts. She wondered if the ghosts were real, or if she had simply carried them from one day into another, wrapped in duty and denial. Outside, the city was already stirring, vendors shouting prices, engines coughing awake, the smell of roasted corn curling through the air. A group of schoolchildren passed her gate, laughing as they jumped puddles, their joy sharp and bright. Lizzie felt an ache deep in her chest, something wordless and heavy. She turned away from the sound and picked up her car keys, her movements slow but practiced. It was another day to bury feeling under work, another day to pretend she had control. Yet, as she locked the door, she hesitated. A single shoe lay by the wall, Claire's old sandal, the strap broken years ago but too sentimental to throw away. Lizzie bent down and touched it lightly, her fingers trembling. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from her bones, she straightened up and left the house, unaware that her life was already beginning to unravel like a loose thread waiting for one careless pull. At the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and desperation greeted her as always. St. Luke's was alive with the rhythm of sickness and survival, doctors hurrying down halls, patients murmuring prayers, a baby crying in the distance. Lizzie walked through it all with her usual poise, the click of her shoes steady as a metronome. She carried authority like a second skin, and people instinctively stepped aside when she passed. "Good morning, Nurse Lizzie," came the chorus from junior nurses. She nodded curtly, her mind already on the ward. There was a boy with severe burns in room 6, a woman in labor in room 3, and a new trainee who had already fainted twice since morning. Lizzie managed it all with frightening efficiency, her hands swift, her tone clipped but precise. Yet under the surface, something was different. Her mind wandered when it shouldn't. The cries of the injured child made her chest tighten. When the mother wept beside the bed, Lizzie found herself pausing longer than usual, unable to deliver the same cold comfort she used to. The sight of that mother clutching her child's hand pulled at something buried in her, a memory she didn't want to feel. Her colleagues noticed the slight hesitation, but said nothing. "Madam Lizzie is aging gracefully," one nurse whispered. "Old wounds catching up with her," another replied. During lunch, she sat alone in the cafeteria, stirring rice she didn't intend to eat. The laughter from a group of younger nurses filled the air, light and careless. Lizzie's gaze drifted toward them, and for a moment she saw her daughter among them. Claire at 17, full of life, mocking the world with her easy grin. The illusion broke when someone called her name. "Nurse Lizzie, emergency in Ward B." She stood up instantly, her composure snapping back like a rubber band. Duty first. Always duty. But as she rushed down the corridor, she felt the truth pressing against her ribs. Duty was the only thing left holding her together. Evening fell slowly, turning the sky over Port Harcourt into a blend of pink and soot gray. Lizzie drove home through the congested streets, the car radio whispering a love song that made her throat tighten. Traffic crawled near mile 1, and her eyes caught glimpses of other lives. A woman selling oranges by the roadside, 2 lovers arguing quietly under an umbrella, a beggar boy weaving between cars. The city pulsed with stories she would never know, but they all seemed to echo the same silent question she asked herself daily. How did everything drift so far away? By the time she reached Cedar Lane, her shoulders felt heavy. She parked the car and sat there for a long while, her hands resting on the steering wheel, unwilling to step back into the stillness of her house. The thought crossed her mind. What if Claire returned home one day? Would she knock, or would she simply walk in, expecting forgiveness to be waiting? Lizzie closed her eyes and saw her daughter as a little girl again, barefoot on the veranda, painting stones with blue chalk. That image stabbed her gently. She had built a world of rules, but lost the only person who made those rules matter. Inside the house, the shadows seemed longer, darker. She turned on the lights, their harsh glow revealing the perfection of emptiness. The clock ticked. The fridge hummed. Every sound reminded her that she was alone. To distract herself, she opened her phone and scrolled through work messages, pretending to care about schedules. But her eyes fell on a contact labeled Claire, my joy. She hadn't deleted the number. Her thumb hovered over the call button, her heart thudding in protest. Finally, she locked the phone, stood up, and poured herself a glass of water. "Tomorrow," she whispered, as though promising herself courage she didn't have. Outside, thunder rumbled again, soft and distant, like an unfinished sentence. Days bled into weeks, each one indistinguishable from the last. Lizzie became a ghost in her own life, efficient, punctual, unbothered on the surface, but hollow inside. People around her began to notice her silences. The hospital matron once said, "Lizzie, you need rest. You look worn thin." Lizzie smiled faintly, that kind of smile that never reached the eyes, and replied, "Rest is for the weak." But deep down, she knew fatigue was not just in her bones, it was in her spirit. At night, when the city dimmed and even the hawkers grew quiet, she would stand by her window watching the flicker of lights across other homes. Laughter would spill from open windows, families gathered for dinner, couples sharing stories, children chasing each other with innocent screams. The noise made her both jealous and terrified. She realized that she had built a life that excluded joy, mistaking control for love, mistaking respect for connection. One night, she found herself walking through the house barefoot, opening doors to rooms she hadn't entered in months. In Claire's old room, dust had settled like memory. The bed was still made, the books still on the shelf, and a faded photo of the 2 of them stood on the desk, a younger Lizzie smiling stiffly beside her teenage daughter. She touched the frame, her fingers tracing the glass. "I only wanted the best for you," she whispered into the quiet. But the room, like the past, offered no answer. The night breeze fluttered the curtains, carrying the distant echo of laughter from somewhere down the street. Lizzie sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes heavy, her heart heavier still. Somewhere in the depths of her chest, she felt the slow awakening of regret, not sharp yet, but steady, like the first trickle of a storm gathering strength. Outside, Port Harcourt carried on with its noisy beauty, but inside that house, a mother's silence grew louder, preparing the ground for what was yet to come. The Harmattan morning came dry and gray, its dusty breath sliding through the half-open window and coating everything in a fine film. Lizzie woke to the soft rasp of wind against her curtains and the sound of her own heartbeat echoing faintly in her ears. She hadn't been sleeping well, Her nights were full of uneasy silence, like a pause before bad news. The world outside her house was stirring again, impatient and alive, the honk of Kiki drivers, the rhythmic pounding of pestles in distant kitchens, the early hawkers calling out bread and akra. Yet inside, it felt as if time had decided to slow down for her alone. The loneliness was no longer a whisper, it was a voice that called her name from every corner of the room. She tried to busy herself with house chores before work, but her mind had developed the habit of drifting, floating between the past and present like a kite without a string. When she entered the sitting room, the faint smell of dust hit her. She realized she hadn't opened the windows in days. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled the curtains apart, and sunlight burst into the space, sudden, unforgiving. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny memories, and she felt, oddly, as if the house was breathing again. On the shelf, she saw a faded envelope sticking out from between her husband's old files. She didn't remember leaving it there. Out of curiosity, she opened it, only to find one of Claire's old letters from school, a cheerful note written in pink ink. "Mum, I got first position. You'll be proud of me this time." The words stung more than she expected. She folded the letter back neatly, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Her eyes blurred. It was absurd that a piece of paper could hurt this much. She sank into the sofa, her head bowed, whispering something between prayer and apology. Then, as if to escape her own thoughts, she stood abruptly and began preparing for work, moving like someone chased by invisible memories. The air felt heavy, and she knew deep down that her life had begun to fold in on itself, quietly but surely, like a curtain closing at the end of a long, exhausting play. At the hospital, Lizzie's steps echoed down the corridor with their usual authority, but her co-workers had started noticing the faint cracks in her armor. She moved slower now, forgot things she would never have missed before. Once, she misplaced a patient file and stood staring blankly at the desk for a full minute before realizing it was in her hand. "Are you all right, Ma?" one of the younger nurses asked timidly. Lizzie forced a smile, though it barely lifted her lips. "I've fine. Just tired." It wasn't a lie, she was tired, but not from work. It was a deeper kind of fatigue, one that came from carrying too many unspoken regrets. Later that day, a young woman was brought into the emergency room, a roadside accident. Her face was bloodied, her eyes swollen shut, but her voice, weak as it was, kept calling, "My daughter, my daughter." Lizzie pressed down on the bleeding, working quickly with the doctor. The woman's grip found her wrist, trembling but firm. "Please don't let me die. My girl's only 4. For a moment, something flickered behind Lizzie's calm expression, recognition, or maybe guilt, she couldn't tell. When the patient stabilized and was wheeled to the ward, Lizzie remained standing there, staring at her gloved hands as if she'd just handled something sacred. That night, she stayed long after her shift ended, sitting on the empty bench outside the hospital. The streetlights hummed, moths circling their dull glow, and the city moved on as if nothing had happened. She thought of the woman's words, "my daughter." How simple, how desperate, how human. The thought struck her. If Claire were to die tonight somewhere in the city, no one would call her. No one would think to. The realization felt like a slap she couldn't defend against. She took a deep breath, stood, and walked toward her car, but her reflection on the window startled her. Her face looked like her mother's now, lined with pride and sorrow in equal measure. "I'm turning into the very thing I feared," she murmured before driving home through the dense Port Harcourt night. When she got home, the housekeeper she had recently hired, a young woman named Anna, greeted her politely and took her bag. Lizzie nodded curtly but didn't speak. Anna was new, barely 3 weeks into the job, but something about her unsettled Lizzie in ways she couldn't explain. The girl was quiet, hard-working, and moved through the house like someone walking on glass. She never looked Lizzie directly in the eye, and her presence filled the silence without breaking it. Lizzie often caught herself studying the girl when she thought no one noticed. There was something familiar in her mannerisms, the way she hummed softly while cleaning, the way she folded laundry with deliberate care. One afternoon, as Lizzie walked past the kitchen, she heard the girl singing under her breath, and her heart clenched. It was the same old hymn Claire used to sing as a child. For reasons she couldn't name, she grew irritated. "Don't you have work to do?" she snapped. Anna startled and nodded quickly. Lizzie didn't know why she was angry, at the girl, at herself, or at the way time mocked her through echoes. The days passed, and her irritation grew. When her favorite necklace went missing, suspicion found its target easily. "Where did you put it?" she demanded. Anna's eyes widened with confusion. "I didn't take anything, Ma." "Maybe, Lizzie didn't let her finish. Don't lie to me. You think I'm a fool? The air between them thickened with fear and accusation. The argument ended with a slap, quick, unplanned, shocking even to Lizzie. Anna's cheeks burned, her eyes filling with tears she didn't let fall. That night, the girl packed her things quietly and left before dawn. In the morning, Lizzie found the necklace exactly where she had left it, in the drawer beneath her scarves. The sight made her legs weak. She sat on the floor and wept into her hands, her tears hot with shame. The house was silent again, but this time it wasn't peace, it was punishment. After Anna's departure, the house seemed to echo with her absence. Lizzie tried to fill the emptiness with work, television, even church on Sundays, but nothing seemed to fit. Her neighbors began noticing she looked thinner, older. The laughter that occasionally drifted from other homes now felt like mockery. Each evening she would return, unlock the gate, and step into the same vacuum of sound, her heels tapping across tiles that no longer felt like hers. Sometimes she would talk aloud just to hear a voice, even if it was her own. "You're fine, Lizzie," she'd mutter while making dinner for one. "You've survived worse." But the mirror always betrayed her, showing a woman unraveling thread by thread. One night, as rain threatened again, she sat by the window, watching lightning flash over the rooftops. She imagined Claire somewhere out there, perhaps walking through the same storm, perhaps not at all. The thought made her chest tighten until she couldn't breathe. She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts again. The name still glowed faintly, Claire, my joy. For the first time, she pressed it. The phone rang once, twice, then stopped. No voice, no answer. Just the endless dial tone filling her ears like a cruel lullaby. She leaned back, tears running freely now. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the darkness, though she wasn't sure who she was apologizing to, the daughter she had lost, the woman she had slapped, or the person she had become. The city outside rumbled on, alive and indifferent, while inside the house on Cedar Lane, one woman's regrets gathered quietly, like floodwater rising in a room no one noticed was leaking. The days that followed Anna's departure carried the kind of silence that scratched at the edges of Lizzie's sanity. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of solitude, it was the kind that hummed with guilt, that whispered through the walls at odd hours, keeping her awake even when her body begged for rest. She found herself drifting through the house like a ghost who had forgotten what it was haunting. The air seemed thicker somehow, as though it too had grown tired of her sharpness. In the mornings, she still wore her uniform and headed for the hospital, but her mind lagged behind, trapped somewhere between memory and regret. One Sunday, she came home after a long shift and noticed the envelope tucked beneath her door. Her first thought was that it was another hospital circular or a neighbor's misdelivered letter. But when she picked it up and saw the handwriting, something inside her chest turned over. It was Claire's writing, shaky, uncertain, but unmistakable. For a long moment she just stared, afraid to open it, as if the paper itself carried an accusation. When she finally unfolded it, her hands trembled. The words were brief, but they cut deep. "Mother, I am alive. Life has not been kind, but I am still breathing. If I cross your mind, pray for me." That last line hollowed her out. She sat on the floor and read it again and again, as if repetition could change the meaning. The handwriting looked tired, much older than the girl who used to write shopping lists for her. The letter smelled faintly of dust and sadness, and when she pressed it to her chest, she realized her heart was beating too fast. Tears came easily this time, not from anger, but from the long, slow ache of understanding that she had lost something she could never buy back, her daughter's trust. For days after, Lizzie carried the letter everywhere, folded neatly in her purse, taking it out whenever she was alone, as if it were proof that her daughter still existed somewhere under the same sky. But each time she read it, guilt pressed heavier, whispering that some prayers come too late to change anything at all. That week, Lizzie's life became a strange balance of hope and torment. She tried to act normal, to speak to her colleagues with her old confidence, but her voice lacked its usual command. Every conversation felt like a performance she no longer believed in. She found herself searching faces on the street, wondering if Claire might be among them, a woman with tired eyes, perhaps selling something by the roadside, or walking with hurried steps to somewhere that wasn't home. She began to see her daughter in everyone, in the pregnant nurse who smiled nervously when spoken to, in the woman carrying a baby at the bus stop, even in the reflection of strangers who passed too quickly to study. One afternoon, she went to the market and found herself standing before a stall selling second-hand clothes. A young woman behind the counter greeted her warmly, and for a second Lizzie's heart faltered, The girl's eyes reminded her of Claire's, soft but wounded. "Madam, you want shirt or gown?" the girl asked, her accent lilting like music from a half-forgotten dream. Lizzie shook her head and walked away, but she kept glancing back until the girl disappeared into the crowd. That night, she called the hospital matron and requested a few days off, citing exhaustion. The matron didn't argue. Even she could see the cracks widening. Lizzie spent those days searching, not with the desperation of a detective, but with the sorrowful persistence of a mother chasing shadows. She visited the places Claire used to love, the cinema near ABA Road, the small restaurant by the waterfront, the bookstore with cracked windows. At each place, she left with the same dull emptiness. People she spoke to offered kind smiles and empty sympathy. "Port Harcourt Big Ma," one shop owner said. "People disappear easy here." That night, Lizzie sat by her window again, the city lights flickering like dying stars. She thought about how strange it was that a mother could know a child's first cry, first word, first fever, and yet not know where that child sleeps when life turns cruel. Weeks passed before Lizzie received another sign of her daughter, though it wasn't in the form she expected. She was returning from the hospital one late evening when she saw a figure standing at her gate, thin, soaked from the rain, holding a small child wrapped in a shawl. For a moment, Lizzie thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but when the figure turned, her heart stopped. "Mother," the voice said, trembling, half-broken. It was Claire, older, thinner, her face carved by hardship, but unmistakably her. The world seemed to tilt as Lizzie ran forward, her bag falling to the ground. She wanted to embrace her, to touch her face and confirm it wasn't a dream. But Claire stepped back slightly, her eyes guarded. "I didn't come to stay," she said quietly. "I came to leave something behind." Her words sounded rehearsed, as if she had been repeating them for courage. From beneath the shawl, she lifted a sleeping girl, no more than 4 years old, her small fingers clutching a toy made from thread. "Her name is Elsie," Claire said. "She's my daughter." Lizzie stared, speechless, the rain blurring her vision. "Claire, come inside. Please, let's talk." But Claire shook her head. "I can't. I have things to fix, things you wouldn't understand." She placed the child gently in Lizzie's arms and pulled something from her neck, a small locket. "Keep this for her," she whispered. Lizzie tried to hold her hand, but Claire slipped away, her shadow dissolving into the storm. Lizzie's cries followed her into the rain, echoing down Cedar Lane, swallowed by thunder. For hours she stood outside, soaked, clutching the child who slept as peacefully as if the world had never known pain. When she finally stepped inside, she placed the girl on the couch, her mind blank and full all at once. It was as though the universe had given her another chance, not of redemption, but of reflection. That night was long and sleepless. Lizzie sat by the child's side, studying her face, the soft cheeks, the slight curve of her mouth, the faint resemblance to both her parents. The storm outside refused to calm, lightning illuminating the room in brief flashes that made everything feel suspended in time. Lizzie thought about her daughter's eyes, full of unspoken stories, and about the strange way life had come full circle. She had lost a child to pride and found one through pain. When morning finally broke, the city was washed clean, the air cool and heavy with renewal. Lizzie brewed tea mechanically, her hands trembling less now, though her mind raced with questions. Where would Claire go? Would she ever return? And what did it mean that she had trusted her mother with the one thing that mattered most? As the child stirred and opened her eyes, Lizzie felt something shift within her, a small crack in the wall she had built around her heart. The girl blinked sleepily and whispered, "Grandma?" The word melted something deep in Lizzie's chest. She knelt beside the couch and pulled the child into her arms, holding her as though afraid she might vanish. For the first time in years, tears came without bitterness. They came clean, like rain on dry soil. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for that morning, she allowed herself to breathe. Outside, the sun rose slowly over Port Harcourt, washing Cedar Lane in gold. The city had no idea of the quiet miracle unfolding within that house, a woman rediscovering the shape of love through the innocence of a child. The following morning, Port Harcourt glistened after a night of light rain, its air cool and filled with the scent of wet concrete and new beginnings. Lizzie stood by the window, watching the early traffic stir the street to life. The cries of hawkers floated faintly through the open curtains, blending with the distant hum of motorcycles. The little girl, Elsie, was awake on the couch, her small fingers tracing the patterns on the armrest. Lizzie had never felt so uncertain of her own house before. The silence that used to be her fortress now felt like a space she had to learn all over again. She brewed tea mechanically and watched the steam rise, curling into the soft light that streamed through the curtains. She found herself humming without realizing it, a tune from her childhood that she hadn't remembered in decades. When Elsie giggled, Lizzie turned sharply, startled by how gentle that sound felt against the quiet. It wasn't the laughter of a visitor or a stranger. It filled the house as though it belonged there. For the first time in many years, Lizzie felt the heavy curtains of grief shift slightly. She knelt beside the child, smoothing her hair. "Did you sleep well?" she asked. The girl nodded, her voice still drowsy. "Yes, Grandma." The word wrapped around Lizzie like a balm and a blade at once, soft but cutting. She blinked back tears, afraid of scaring the child with emotions she couldn't explain. When Elsie smiled, Lizzie saw traces of Claire, those same mischievous dimples, that same calm in the eyes. It was like holding a piece of her daughter that time had forgotten to ruin. She made breakfast, guiding the child to eat slowly, her hands clumsy from years of not serving anyone but herself. The child's laughter rose again, chasing away the ghosts that had lived in those walls for too long. And though Lizzie said nothing aloud, she whispered within herself that maybe, just maybe, this little girl had been sent to teach her how to love again. Days began to blend into a rhythm that Lizzie hadn't known since Claire was young. She would wake before sunrise, no longer to iron uniforms or prepare for the hospital, but to listen for the soft breathing of the child asleep in the next room. Her once lonely kitchen now carried the warmth of burnt toast and the occasional childish humming. She noticed things she had ignored for years: the way sunlight fell across the tiled floor, the gentle hum of ceiling fans, even the distant sounds of the neighbors' radios. The house, once a place of strict order, had begun to live again. Still, a shadow lingered in Lizzie's chest, a question that refused to quiet down. Where was Claire now? Each night, after putting Elsie to bed, she would sit with the old letter in her lap, tracing the familiar handwriting. She had hired someone discreet from the hospital, a clerk whose cousin worked with the local police, to help her search for her daughter quietly. Every evening, she waited for a call that never came. Sometimes she would drive through the city after work, glancing down crowded streets, slowing near bus stops, her heart racing whenever she saw a woman with a familiar walk or posture. Port Harcourt, with its sprawling chaos, seemed determined to hide Claire. But in the midst of that ache, she found a strange calm. Caring for Elsie demanded attention, and the child gave love without caution or fear. Each time she said "Grandma," something in Lizzie healed, however slightly. She began taking the child to a nearby park on weekends, watching her chase after pigeons while she sat on a bench under the shade of almond trees. Other mothers smiled at her politely, assuming Elsie was her daughter, and Lizzie found herself nodding rather than correcting them. It was easier that way. Easier to pretend she had not once lost everything that mattered. In those moments, as the breeze carried children's laughter through the park, she allowed herself the illusion of a second chance. But nights were a different story. When the city quieted and the last buses had passed, the old silence returned, though softer now, less cruel, more like an uninvited guest who had learned some manners. Lizzie would sit by the window, the soft hum of the fridge in the background, and think of Claire. Some nights she imagined her daughter alive but struggling. Other nights she feared the worst. The fear was worst when the phone rang unexpectedly, only for it to be a wrong number or one of her colleagues checking on her. She tried to pray, but her prayers tangled between guilt and hope. She wanted forgiveness, but didn't know if she deserved it. One night, while Elsie slept, Lizzie decided to open Claire's locket. It was a small gold piece, slightly tarnished from years of wear. Inside, there was a faded picture, Claire as a child, smiling shyly beside Lizzie, both of them caught in a rare moment of happiness. Beneath the photo was a folded scrap of paper, so tiny she almost missed it. When she unfolded it carefully, her heart skipped. No one learns love from loneliness. The handwriting was Claire's. Lizzie sat frozen, her tears falling onto the paper, the words blurring but not fading. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat beside the child, stroking her hair gently, whispering promises to the air. She vowed to protect Elsie with everything she had, to love her without the iron barriers she had once built around Claire. The night stretched long and quiet, but Lizzie felt a strange peace settle in her chest. She knew the past couldn't be undone, but perhaps its echoes could be softened by tenderness. Morning arrived again, golden and calm. Lizzie took Elsie's small hand as they walked toward the main road, heading for the market. People greeted her differently now. Smiles that used to fade when she approached lingered longer, warmer. The transformation wasn't sudden, but it was visible. The once stern nurse now laughed at small jokes, helped the neighbor's son with his scraped knee, shared food with the gatekeeper. The bitterness that had once defined her had begun to dissolve quietly, replaced by something gentler, though it carried the texture of sorrow. One afternoon, as she helped Elsie draw pictures on old newspaper, she heard a knock at the gate. Her heart jumped. Through the narrow slit, she saw a familiar man in a worn suit, the clerk from the hospital who had promised to help her find Claire. "Madam," he said softly, his face grave. "We found her." Lizzie's breath caught. "Where?" The man hesitated, eyes lowered. "At the city clinic. She's alive but weak. She's been sick for a long time." Lizzie didn't wait for more. She called the neighbor to watch Elsie and drove through the city like a woman possessed, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. When she reached the clinic, she found Claire lying on a narrow bed, her face pale, her frame thin but still, unmistakably, her daughter's. Claire opened her eyes slowly, recognition flickering in their depths. "Mother," she whispered. Lizzie fell to her knees beside the bed, clutching her hand. For a long time neither spoke. The room smelled of medicine and rain. Tears slipped silently down Lizzie's face. "I thought I'd never see you again," she said. Claire smiled faintly. "You found me. That's enough." In that fragile moment, surrounded by the hum of machines and the scent of disinfectant, Lizzie finally understood what mercy felt like. A quiet, steady thing that asked for nothing but presence. The following weeks unfolded with the tenderness of a long-awaited sunrise. Lizzie spent every evening at the city clinic, her routines rearranged around Claire's slow recovery. The sterile white walls no longer felt hostile. They became sacred, like the inside of a chapel where forgiveness had quietly taken residence. Each day she arrived with a flask of pepper soup or jollof, foods Claire had loved as a girl. The nurses watched their bond carefully, whispering that the old nurse who once barked orders now sat by a bedside holding hands and humming old hymns. Claire's voice grew stronger with each passing day, though her body remained fragile, her laughter sometimes dissolving into coughing fits. One night, as rain beat softly on the clinic's tin roof, she asked, "Mother, do you hate me for leaving?" Lizzie hesitated, her eyes tracing the raindrops sliding down the window pane. "No, my child," she said finally, her voice trembling with years of things unsaid. "I hated myself for not making home a place you wanted to stay." Claire smiled faintly, tears pooling at the edges of her eyes. "You were just scared," she whispered. "So was I." The room grew quiet except for the gentle rhythm of rain. Lizzie reached out and touched her daughter's cheek, her thumb brushing away a tear. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to be soft without shame. Every sigh, every glance between them carried the weight of reconciliation, fragile but real. She would watch her daughter drift into sleep and think how love could survive even the longest separations if it chose to. Sometimes she would return home after midnight, her clothes damp from the mist, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. Elsie would be asleep on the couch, clutching her doll, and Lizzie would stand there in the faint glow of the lamp, realizing that the circle of pain that had once governed her life was quietly breaking apart. As the weeks stretched into a month, Lizzie began to see beauty in ordinary things again. The clinic visits turned into laughter-filled evenings, and the distance between mother and daughter melted like ice under morning sun. Claire, though still weak, began to talk about her years away, about the struggles, the mistakes, the nights she slept in bus parks, and the mornings she thought of coming home but couldn't bear the shame. Lizzie listened without interruption, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Each word was a confession wrapped in pain, but Lizzie received them like prayers. "You did what you had to survive," she said once, when Claire broke down midway through a story about working in a small roadside canteen. "You're here now. That's all that matters." And for the first time, Claire believed her. In those moments, the past felt like a book that had finally been read to its end, its pain acknowledged but no longer dictating the next page. When Claire grew strong enough to leave the clinic, Lizzie brought her home. The reunion with Elsie was a symphony of tears and laughter. The child ran into her mother's arms with a joy so pure that even the neighbors who peeked through their windows felt their eyes sting. That night, 3 generations shared a meal in the same house that had once known only echoes. Lizzie looked across the table, her gaze moving between her daughter and granddaughter, and thought how strange it was that healing could be so quiet, so humble. There were no grand speeches, no promises made, only small gestures, passing a plate, wiping a tear, resting a hand on another's shoulder, that spoke the language of forgiveness better than words ever could. The house on Cedar Lane no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a heart learning to beat again. Life settled into a gentle rhythm, but time, as always, had its own plans. Claire began helping her mother with small chores, humming as she swept, laughing with Elsie as they cooked together. Lizzie watched them, sometimes smiling, sometimes silently weeping when they weren't looking. She had found what she didn't know she was missing, a sense of belonging that didn't depend on control. Yet her body had begun to betray her. The long years of exhaustion and unspoken grief had worn her down in ways she couldn't hide. One evening, after putting Elsie to bed, she felt a sharp pain in her chest, deep and unrelenting. She sat in her chair, pressing her palm to her heart, breathing through it until the wave passed. She didn't tell anyone, not even Claire. She didn't want to burden the new peace they had just begun to build. Instead, she moved slower, took more breaks, and smiled through the pain. When Claire noticed her growing fatigue, Lizzie dismissed it with a soft laugh. "Age is catching up with me," she'd say. But at night, when everyone slept, she would stare at the ceiling and think of Michael, her late husband, and wonder if he could see the woman she had become. She hoped he would be proud. Sometimes she spoke to him softly, her lips barely moving. "I fixed it, Mike," she'd whisper. "Not perfectly, but I fixed what I could." The pain would fade long enough for her to sleep, and her dreams were filled with images of laughter. Claire as a child, Elsie chasing butterflies, herself standing under sunlight that didn't hurt to feel. The morning Lizzie didn't wake, the sun was unusually kind. The house was full of quiet warmth, as though the walls themselves knew to stay gentle. Claire found her sitting by the window, her head tilted slightly, a faint smile on her lips, the locket still clasped in her hand. She looked peaceful, untouched by the noise of the world she had finally made peace with. Claire didn't cry immediately. She simply knelt beside her mother and held her hand, whispering words only the living can offer the dead: gratitude, apology, love. When she finally called for help, the neighbors came running, their faces heavy with sorrow but softened by admiration. The news spread down Cedar Lane. The iron nurse had gone home. In the days that followed, the house became a place of constant footsteps and quiet prayers. People came to pay respects, to tell stories of the woman who had once frightened them but later surprised them with kindness. When the crowd thinned and night returned, Claire sat by the window where her mother had spent so many hours and looked out at the lavender bushes glowing faintly under the moonlight. Elsie slept in the next room, her breathing steady and light. Claire held the locket in her palm and smiled through her tears. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, and the breeze carried the faint scent of rain. For a long moment, the world seemed perfectly still. Then she whispered, "Rest now, Mama. We'll be fine." Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, brushing against the walls of the old house like a gentle hand saying goodbye. And for the first time in many years, Cedar Lane felt at peace, not empty, not haunted, but whole. Sometimes life teaches us through the quiet pain of our own mistakes. Lizzie's story reminds us that pride can build walls where love should have built doors. If you're listening right now, let this be a gentle whisper to your heart. Don't wait until the people you love become memories before you learn to hold them close. Apologize when it's still daylight, forgive even when it's hard, and speak kindness while there's still a voice to hear you. Love may not erase the past, but it can heal what regret cannot reach. No matter how far things have fallen apart, there's always a road back home, sometimes paved with humility, sometimes lit by the smallest act of grace. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of love and second chances. Teach our hearts to soften where they've grown hard, and to see people the way you see them. Lord, heal every home broken by pride, and every heart wounded by silence. Let your mercy rewrite the stories that pain once tried to end. Bless the mothers who carry burdens they never speak of, and the children who still long to be understood. Fill every listener's life with peace, forgiveness, and the courage to love deeply and without fear. May homes that have known sorrow find laughter again, and may hearts that have wandered far find their way back to warmth. In your grace, let every dry place bloom again, every wound close gently, and every life sing of redemption. If you believe this prayer, say a heartfelt amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.